Climate change, we have a limited amount of time to resolve it, and it concerns everyone, literally everyone.
How could we stay under 2 degrees C? Everybody has to do everything possible.
Doing things sustainably is even more modern than modern.
The technology exists, the money exists, the political will doesn't exist.
If we miss this opportunity, that means a few more years. Potentially it's going to be too late.
We have one more shot at this in Paris.
Our window is closing, but our window's still open. In Bonn, Salimul was talking about how the money is there, the technology is there, but the political will isn't there. So like in terms of implementing what COP21, what's going to come out of COP21, and in terms of like building support around it, those are kind of like the three things. Like you need money, you need the technology, and you need the political will. And you kind of need all three
to be
working together.
Yeah. And I guess also where the gap is.
Probably the biggest gap is in political will. But I don't know. So I feel like if we explore so like the political will, what are people doing right now to build political will? What are people doing to build our technological ability? And what are people doing to gather all the money and put it in the right places so that those three areas can work together and we can actually like get this done? You hear all these great things are being said, like all the rhetoric is really good about like we're gonna do this, we're gonna solve it. But then you're kind of like, well, but like how? Like what's the plan? And it seems like you guys are saying, okay, like if you're going to do that, here's how you do it.
The idea is that the project is trying to demonstrate that this transition is feasible, both technically and economically. I am Laura Segafredo, and I lead the Deep Decarbonization Pathways project at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a center of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. It's long, but yeah, I know.
Got it all.
It's a mouthful. It's essentially, right, getting off fossil fuels. I mean, that's really the biggest challenge. And also getting the right policies in place and also sequencing those policies the right way and having the long-term target, in mind as you move there.
Your long-term target is 2050.
Yes. So we're looking at 2050 and where we need to be in 2050. Now, we look at this and we look at the carbon budget. So how many greenhouse gases can we still emit into the atmosphere in order to hit the 2-degree target, right? Let's say that it's 15 gigatons of CO2 emissions from the energy sector in 2050. So we take that limit and then we basically say, we look at world population projections in 2050. And very simply what we do is we divide those 15 gigatons by the population. That gives us a carbon budget of about 1.6 to 1.7 tons of CO2e per person per year in 2050. And then we tell our teams, this is our sort of benchmark. This is our objective in 2050. Now we need to try and reach it and meet it. And so in some countries like the US, Australia, pretty much all developed industrialized countries, that means a significant reduction in emissions. I mean, in the US, we're talking from 20 tons a person today to 1.6, 1.7.
Wow. So right
so that's
now,
what we're looking at.
I'm producing 20 tons.
Yeah. 20 tons of CO2e per year.
CO2 equivalent, that's what the E means.
Yeah.
So all the kind of greenhouse gases you even,
Yeah.
wow. And by 2050 I need to be producing 1.6.
1.7, yeah.
And so you're figuring out how we get from point A to point B.
Correct. Yes. And that's the idea, right? So our point A to point B, so we basically start at point B and we look backwards and we say, what do we need in order to achieve point B, considering we're at point A today, right? And that's how we think about this problem.
To me, the financing question is really at the crux of it for how we get to a 2 degrees Celsius world. Hi, I'm Aniket Shah. I'm the program leader for our Financing for Sustainable Development initiative at the Sustainable Development Solutions Network.
For someone like us who
Sure.
don't know much about it, what
Sure.
should we be keeping our eyes on?
Sure. The first point would be there is a lot of money in this world. The International Energy Agency says for us to get to a 2 degrees Celsius climate change world, we will need to invest $53 trillion of investments in low carbon energy from today to 2035. Now that sounds like a huge amount of money.
That sounds like a lot of money.
But if you do the arithmetic, $53 trillion over 20 years is $2 to $2.5 trillion a year. We live in a $100 trillion world economy growing 3 to 4% every year. So for 2% of the entire world economy, we can make this transition.
It's not a question of not having the money. The money is there. And our analysis suggests that the investments that are necessary to realize this deep decarbonization transformation are not significantly higher than what we would need to spend anyways to replace the infrastructure in place. So the way that we look at deep decarbonization is essentially through three pillars of transformation for the energy systems. Number one is increasing energy efficiency in all uses. So from buildings, cars, industrial uses, etc. It pays off to be energy efficient. And it's really a matter of being smart about using our own resources. So I think that is like a no-brainer. Number two is reducing the carbon intensity of electricity and fuels. It makes no sense to use technologies that are 200 years old. We have the technology today to produce power with absolutely no carbon, and really at a zero marginal cost if you use renewable sources like sun and wind. It really makes sense to make that the core of our power systems. And the third is switch most other energy uses to either electricity, once we've cleaned up the power system, or other fuels that have zero carbon content. Let's think about electrifying public transit and making sure that we transport freight over, I don't know, it could be hydrogen or biofuels. Aviation can use biofuels. I mean, there's a lot of technological solutions there that can be improved and need to be improved, but I think we pretty much know what needs to be done. The infrastructure that we invest in today will definitely be there in 2050, most likely beyond 2050. And so that's why it's important to think about this fairly well in advance. And it's important to have objectives that are longer term.
Yeah.
We need investments, long-term investments in mitigation, so low carbon energy, in adaptation, so infrastructure that supports a world that has some climate change, in research. We don't yet have all of the technologies that we need to be in a 2 degrees Celsius world. We certainly don't have them at a cost that's commercially viable. Carbon capture and sequestration is one of those, where the basic technology exists, but it's still too expensive. So we need more investments in that. We need more investments in fuel storage, in batteries, which you see people like Elon Musk really trying to tackle. And then the fourth type of investments are in losses and damages, which the insurance sector will in large part have to figure out. So those are the four buckets. That's the uses of it. The sources of climate finance are also very important to think through. You have government, public money, and then you have private finance. And so the big question is then the partnership between the government and the private sector.
I've heard a lot about these public-private partnerships. Like,
Yeah.
how do you actually make those?
Yeah, public-private partnerships for a lot of people is a dirty word, unfortunately, because the way that cynics think of PPPs, which is the acronym for it, is that the public sector has to take all the risk and the private sector makes all the profits. So you need to structure PPPs in a way that the private sector also has to participate in some of the downside, and at the same way that the public sector gets to participate in some of the upside. These things are possible, but new institutions are needed to intermediate this type of investment. So you should be looking out for things like the Green Climate Fund, like the New York Green Bank, like the Connecticut Green Bank, and these things will start popping up around us.
It's essentially a new industrial revolution. We have an opportunity today in industrialized economies to really invest money in a system that is future-proof in a sense. And developing countries have an opportunity to completely leapfrog a model of development that it's true that we use. I mean, clearly the Western world became wealthy burning fossil fuels, that's true. But we now know that we have a model of development that's entirely different and that allows for growth and prosperity without really all these negative consequences on the environment. So I think this is an amazing opportunity.
If we don't do that, where will we be in 2050?
If we don't do that,
business as usual.
Exactly. So business as usual. So where we are going to be in 2100, because the temperature change is measured over the next century, is a warming that's likely going to be between 3.7 and 4.8. So essentially 4 degrees, roughly, twice as much as the level that we consider safe. And just to clarify, even 2 degrees Celsius is a significant change in climate. I think we should look at it as an insurance policy in a sense, right? And because we know that we know some of the consequences, but we can't anticipate all of them. And the human price will be high. So even if it costs you a little bit more today, you're avoiding a catastrophe in the future, I think it's worth it.
So what I was struck with, again, is like talking to Laura, the technology is there. The pathways are there. Like they've put these pathways in place and like they can do it. And talking to Aniket, he's like, the money is there.
I mean, if we have all these things in place, we have all the political people saying this is what we need to do. We have the scientists saying this is what we need to do. We have the money in place. Why hasn't it happened sooner, you know?
And if you don't do that for another 20 years, then it's probably going to be too late. Or definitely going to be too late to stay under 2 degrees. So it's really like this like very small window of time. And everything's there. It's just
it's so fragile. It's like if the earth goes, we have nothing. So what is the issue?
The will is certainly growing. People are now accepting that the world has to move in this direction and has to do it fairly quickly. But the numbers don't back it up yet.
But what comes out of COP21 is going to be super important in terms of directing, telling the world this is where we're going.
And the number one thing that can come out of COP21 in that regard is a price on carbon.